In this Diablo 4 Necromancer leveling build, I'll show you a Necro Build that makes use of the Necromancer's new Sever aspect, as well as the new Shadow Ultimate Soulrift. If you enjoy builds where you set up a bunch of buffs, then spam an ability to blend enemies to find dust, then this Necro leveling build will be perfect for you. As always, be sure to check out our Diablo 4 wiki and interactive map if you need help finding specific Altars of Lilith, dungeons, or side quests. This Necromancer build revolves entirely around maximizing our DPS with Sever, one of the Necromancer's core shadow skills. The recent patch for Vessel of Hatred introduced a new aspect, Reaping Lotus, which is the cornerstone of this build. Reaping Lotus splits Sever into 3 specters, dealing up to 200% of the original damage. Thanks to this new aspect, I managed to make a build that can be best described as a smoothie blender, with scythes chopping up enemies rapidly as they stand in place stunned and grouped with corpse tendrils. It's a pretty satisfying build, which I found very fun to optimize and tinker around with. The main idea is to buff the damage we get from casting Sever as much as we can from our aspects and skills, while also getting a bunch of essence so we can spam cast it. The new Soulrift ultimate is the perfect supporting skill for these goals, generating essence every second and giving a damage buff of up to 30%. It's also a darkness skill just like Sever, so any darkness damage stats will apply to both Sever and Soulrift. Our last damaging skill to round out the build is Blighted Corpse Explosion, another darkness skill that we can buff with aspects and passives to further empower our Sever playstyle. We're aiming to create the perfect setup to maximize the power of each Sever cast using Decrepify, Corpse Tendrils, and Blighted Corpse Explosion to amplify damage. So let's take a look at the skill tree. In the basic cluster, I put 2 points into Decompose for Enhanced Decompose. This is a skill that actually stuck with my build the full way through, since there aren't really any great essence generators that you can find early on in the game. We do have the Umbral aspect for some regeneration when we use our main combos, but against tough bosses, using Decompose to get some corpses and essence from time to time is very helpful. In the core cluster, we want to max out Sever to get our maximum possible damage output, and we get the modifier Paranormal Sever, which makes enemies vulnerable every third cast. We will be building for vulnerable damage alongside crit damage, and this is one of the few sources of vulnerable we have, so it's pretty important to get. In this branch, we also get the Hued Flesh passive, which is incredibly important for corpse generation. Lucky hit chance will be one of the central themes in this build, since Sever can get around 50% lucky hit chance, and being able to spawn a corpse from Sever is very important for leading on with Corpse Tendrils and Blighted Corpse Explosion. The passive after Hued Flesh is imperfectly balanced, which increases the cost of Sever by 9%, but also increases its damage by 15%. The 9% increase in essence is something we can optimize from Affixes later, and the 15% damage buff is multiplicative, which is very valuable for this build. In the first Corpse and Macabre cluster after core skills, we put max points into Corpse Explosion and choose the Blighted modifier so it becomes a darkness skill, dealing shadow damage over time. We want this mainly to activate the Shadow Blight key passive, but also for the extra buffs from passives in this cluster. The Fueled by Death passive will give us a 9% increase in damage for 6 seconds after consuming a corpse, and the Grim Harvest passive gives us 6 essence every time we consume a corpse. One other passive in this tree that's pretty good is Titan's Fall, which increases damage to elites by up to 18% when fortified. This is only useful once we get the passive Necrotic Carapace later down the line, which fortifies you for 5% of your max life when you generate a corpse from skills. This Fortify actually stacks up surprisingly fast, since we have a very high lucky hit chance from our skills, and the max points into Hued Flesh means we're generating corpses very quickly. With enough speed, you can maintain Fortify for basically a whole dungeon, which is why I think this 18% buff is pretty good for this build. Moving into the Curse cluster, we first have Decrepify. Decrepify will apply a slow to all enemies afflicted, giving us some crowd control, and most importantly will give us cooldown reduction with the abhorrent Decrepify modifier. This modifier gives a 15% chance to reduce one of your active cooldowns by 1 second when you lucky hit against enemies afflicted with Decrepify. The plan with this skill is to hit a bunch of enemies with Sever, Corpse Explosion, and Soulrift, get as many lucky hits as possible to reduce the cooldown of Soulrift since it's on a 40-second cooldown. In this cluster, we also max the Precision Decay passive to increase our lucky hit chance, since this is a core characteristic of our build. In the second Corpse and Macabre cluster, we have the skill Corpse Tendrils with the modifier Plagued Corpse Explosion, which will group up enemies, stun them, and make them vulnerable. This is the most important supporting skill for Sever, since the size of Sever isn't exactly large, and grouping them up increases the amount of hits and lucky hits we'll be proccing with every cast of Sever. Also, as a plus, you can equip the Umbral aspect to recharge some essence when you cast this skill, since it crowd controls a bunch of enemies. There's also a bunch of passives in this cluster focused on empowering our darkness skills, which we'll want to mostly max out. Reaper's Pursuit will increase our movement speed by up to 15% while we deal damage with Darkness. Bloom will make enemies take up to 18% more darkness damage. Crippling Darkness will stun unlucky hit with darkness skills, and Terror will deal 9% increased darkness damage to slowed enemies, and 9% more to stunned enemies. To get the max value out of Terror, you'll need to slow it to Crepify, then stun with either Crippling Darkness or Corpse Tendrils. Also note that you should probably only put 1 point into Crippling Darkness just to get the stun, since the extra points don't do too much. The other passive I chose in this tree is the aforementioned Necrotic Carapace to give us Fortify. Again, you only really need 1 point in this passive to make it work. In the ultimate cluster, I maxed out Soulrift and got its 2 modifiers. Soulrift will deal shadow damage every second, not shadow damage over time, and absorbs up to 3 souls of nearby enemies every 0.25 seconds, granting you a small barrier and 2 essence. Once you get the 2 modifiers, you'll deal 30% extra damage once you absorb 30 souls and apply vulnerable to enemies that you absorb. This is the big damage button for this build, since you get all these bonuses which help you deal more damage and amps up your essence to spam cast Sever. You can also get 3 points into the Finality passive in this cluster to deal an extra 15% damage after casting your ultimate for 8 seconds. The other passives in this branch are Standalone for 18% damage reduction while we have no minions, and Inspiring Leader to gain 12% crit chance while healthy. Lastly, the key passive. For this build, I went with the Shadow Blight passive since our damage is shadow damage, and will easily proc this key passive multiple times. Given a few tweaks to the build, you could also theoretically try the new key passive Affliction, which will basically increase your damage by 15% and make curse skills deal shadow damage as well. Personally, I think this is probably better later on in the game as part of an endgame build. Shadow Blight feels good to level with, so that's what I went for here. Minions are not very valuable for this build once you get everything set up, but they are useful in the early game. I'd say for that first 20 levels or so, minions are pretty useful, but from then on, they're better off sacrificed. For Skeletal Warriors, you should sacrifice the Reapers for 10% increased shadow damage for basically all your leveling. Once you reach Torment 1, which reduces your resistances, you may want to swap the sacrifice to Defenders for the extra 25% resistance to all elements. The other 2 sacrifices are basically the same throughout your playthrough. Sacrifice Cold Mages for 20% increased vulnerable damage, and sacrifice the Iron Golem for a 35% increase to critical strike damage. Moving on to equipment, gems, and aspects. Luckily, most of the aspects in this Necromancer build are obtained from dungeons, but you will need to find the Reaping Lotus aspect in order to exponentially boost the damage of this build. The following are the best aspects. Reaping Lotus aspect. This is the best aspect for this build, turning Sever into a smoothie blender. I would recommend putting this on either your amulet or a 2-handed weapon since it's very important for our damage. Aspect of the Damned. I put this on a 2-handed sword or axe to get the double effect for this passive, since all 3 of our major damage output is from darkness skills, so a 100% bonus to that is great. Just make sure you're cursing enemies regularly to get the full value. Next is Aspect of Grasping Veins. Since Corpse Tendrils doesn't cost any resource and doesn't even consume a corpse, we'll basically be spamming this off cooldown for as long as we have corpses. The reduced cooldown on abilities from hitting enemies with Decrepify makes Corpse Tendrils recharge really fast with large groups of enemies, so this aspect will be on basically all the time when fighting big groups. Aspect of Decay and Blighted Aspect. Since we're doing tons of shadow damage that proc Shadow Blight very often, it makes sense to get the aspects that make Shadow Blight even better. These work passively, so there isn't any changes to gameplay you need to accommodate for. And the Umbral Aspect. This aspect is great for any time Soulrift is on cooldown and you need energy to cast Sever. This build can get very essence hungry, so this aspect is great for trying to get more sustain early in the game. Later on, there will be plenty of uniques to help you with your resource management. Other good aspects for this build are Aspect of Hardened Bones, Aspect of Disobedience, Aspect of the Cursed Aura, and Aspect of Metamorphosis. For affixes, you'll want to generally focus on intelligence, crit and vulnerable damage, crit chance, damage over time, and armor, resistances, or life. Ideally, you'll want to try and get crit chance on all your jewelry and gloves since crits are the majority of your damage. Also, try to pump vulnerable damage more than I did. I got some pretty unlucky rolls and was only able to get a measly 44% when you should have around 200%. You should switch between 2-handed swords and axes depending on whether you need the inherent critical damage or vulnerable affix if possible to balance it out. Besides damage, you generally want to get more armor and resistances as you get further into the game, since Torment difficulties will lower your armor and resistances to a point where survivability becomes more important than damage. There are a few specific affixes I recommend. For Helm, Chest, and Legs, you want armor, max life, resistances, and cooldown reduction on Helmet, of course. For Glove, you want critical strike chance, critical strike damage, damage over time, or ranks to Sever. For Boots, you want intelligence, movement speed, or armor, or ranks to Corpse Tendrils. For Two-handed Weapon, you want intelligence, vulnerable damage, or critical strike damage, and damage over time. For Amulet, you want ranks to Gloom, critical strike chance, movement speed, armor, or resistance if necessary. On Rings, critical strike chance, intelligence, and critical strike damage. When it comes to gems, you want the following. On your weapon, you want Emerald, Sapphire, or Amethyst, depending on which damage you lack. On armor, you want topaz to add more intelligence, and for jewelry, you'll want to add the elemental resistances that you're lacking or armor if you're missing from the skull gems to get to your 1000 armor cap. When it comes to tempering, there are a few really good tempers for this build. Firstly, Shadow augments execution for weapons that have an affix, which gives a chance to cast Sever twice, which doubles the Reaping Lotus's 3 specters into 6 when it triggers. There's also Execution Innovation, which has an affix to increase the size of Sever by up to 20%, which I highly recommend as well. Other than damage, you should also try to get Lucky Hit chance to restore essence from the World Stability Resource Temper, since we're hitting a bunch of lucky hits on this build. Final tips. For some final tips, I want to summarize what this build does. Decrepify adds a slow and stun crowd control, which is great for the Umbral aspect, reduces cooldowns, and gives us the damned aspect increase to our shadow damage. Corpse Explosion gives us 9% extra damage, generates essence, and triggers Shadow Blight often from the blighted aspect. Corpse Tendrils adds a slow for Umbral, adds vulnerable, and gives crit chance and damage with the Grasping Veins aspect. Soulrift gives us a huge essence boost, increases damage up to 30%, and adds vulnerable. Lastly, Sever has a 46% lucky hit chance, which we can use to create corpses, fortify, or reduce cooldowns with Decrepify. We use Reaping Lotus for a big damage boost, and Temper for double cast plus size. The main combo I found myself getting used to is to sever a big group of enemies until corpses were made, then use Corpse Tendrils to group them up. Once they get pulled, then Decrepify and ult for maximum possible damage output and spam Sever. Against bosses, this build is a bit hit or miss. Most of the time, you'll melt bosses by generating corpses with Sever and getting energy back from Soulrift. However, sometimes you just don't proc the lucky hits, which is why I kept the Decompose basic skill to keep myself from getting soft block on Essence in these boss fights. Once you get further into the game with more uniques for Essence, you can probably respec some skill points and get rid of Decompose and replace it with Blood Mist. Until then, I recommend using the aspect of Metamorphosis on your boots to get out of crowd control, which is something I found incredibly useful. There's also 2 fantastic uniques you can get at the end game, one of which is called the Unmaker from the Beast in Ice and Torment, and the other Greaves of the Empty Tube from Grigory the Galvanic Saint. These are practically made for this build, so I highly recommend farming them once you get to Torment 1. So that wraps up our Necromancer leveling build guide. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This build is designed to get you to Torment level 1 and through Torment level 1, and we didn't incorporate any Paragon points in this build just so you can see its effectiveness without them. Most players will have some at this point, so the build should be even more effective for you. Stay tuned because we have more Diablo 4 content coming, including more build guides that are leveling and endgame based. If you have questions about the build, please leave them in the comments below.